Yeah, it's interesting, Brian. I want to ask you this because it's related to something in the cold open. Speaking of like pressures to change on certain issues, you mentioned that kind of this idea of like when you find an idol, there become all these attendant blasphemy laws that are attached to it. It seems like if you're talking about the Jews, if you're talking about historical questions about World War II, like, for example, if we go back and we question the history of the Battle of Vienna in 1683, nobody cares. But it seems like particularly there's a list of subjects right now that you can get in a lot of trouble, whether it's a historical question, whether you're trying to determine like, genealogical questions about the Jews, whatever. I know that as you delve into them on social media, you have the sense that you're like, are we walking on thin ice here? Because culturally it's so unacceptable. So my question for you is, how do you think through, okay, does that mean we just shouldn't address those things?
Yeah.
We certainly have to make value judgments on, importance level that we put on them. But how do you think through that?
I mean, you do have to be quite careful and precise in how you're thinking through some of these things. So give you some examples, and like one of the fallacies I think can come into play that we see played out, and we all have to be aware of. You think about the transgenderism and some of the sexual madness and gender madness that's been ascendant in the last 20 years. Really, it goes back quite a bit further than that. To Gramscian Marxist strategy to undermine the natural family and kind of slowly march through the institutions to dissolve the Christianity of the West to make them a conquerable foe to some modified form of communism or socialism. So that's the long play. But when you think about what that's been like experientially for us, it meant that when you're an 11th grader in public school, as I was, and you maybe want to notice something about the difference between men and women and their strength or something like that, and say like, I really, the Air Force or the Marines or whatever, they just kind of said, let's open up standards to allow women to serve in combat in certain roles or things like that. And you might want to notice, well, but hang on, women aren't strong in the way men are strong physically. They don't seem to be suited in their nature to combat. Maybe you don't even cite a Bible verse, but you're just noticing sort of there's a check in you that knows and it's sometimes visible, sometimes invisible, sometimes opaque, sometimes transparent. You know that you've been discipled to be careful about saying something like that out loud. And in that case, there really is a blasphemy law operating, which is egalitarianism and feminism, where we're trying to dissolve all distinctions of hierarchy, because hierarchy is highly problematic to a Marxist worldview or a worldview that's attempting to flatten everything. So it's like, one big, I've said before, and all the Kansans get mad at me, to make everything like one big Kansas. Sorry, guys. Nebraska's flat too. One big Nebraska. So there's real blasphemy laws operating there. You could give many, many examples of this where the blasphemy laws are surrounding an idol or an opposing ideology, a god and his opposing ideology. Now, we do need to be careful, though, of what I've seen called the YouTube commenter fallacy, which is that it's basically a two-step argument. And it's, imagine somebody commenting on YouTube, and in the first pane of the meme, they notice, whenever I say the truth about such and such subject, everybody gets mad at me. And so then in the second pane, they conclude, and this is fallaciously, they conclude, therefore, anytime anybody is mad at me or pushes back against something I say, I must be right, which is not actually true. You can say something dumb and also have people mad at you or disagree with you. And I bring that up because what that then requires is that we have sobriety when we approach these issues, and we have to be thinking in terms of truth. So we talked in the cold open about steel manning your opponents. We called it the courtesy of specificity, but that's basically just steel manning, which is it's for your opponent, but it's also for you. Because when you're able to present somebody else's argument in a way you think they would agree with, that is what I'm saying, and then say, okay, and here's why I think you're wrong, reason, that protects everybody from fallacious, emotional kind of reasoning that's steered by the gaze of some god and its attendant blasphemy laws. Now, what's dangerous about that is that it can lead you into some places that are, let's say, politically incorrect, where maybe you start doing this and you're going down a rabbit hole. And, all of us who went to public school, to the previous illustration, know what this is like. All of a sudden you're like, the people who are supposed to be teaching me, they actually don't know what they're talking about. Because even when I steel man their position, it's nonsense. It's word salad. It doesn't make sense. It's emotional. It's blustering. It's unfair. It's straw man. It's not driven by reason. It's not driven by data. It's not internally consistent, or it's not coherent and consistent with the external world. It's valid but unsound. It's invalid and unsound. Like, you start going through that, and that puts you in a dangerous place where you can be in a position to be the guy that's like, I think that this thing is true, and yet I know if I say that it is true, many people will want to not just disagree with me, but destroy me by any means possible.
Right.
So there's like landmines all around, and it calls for sobriety. I think it calls for care.
Well, don't you think there's a point here about Christians should argue a certain way? So Doug has made this point in the past, like, you want to steel man your opponent, meaning you put his argument in terms that he would agree with, right? So you fairly represent. This kind of goes to the gas cloud fallacy, as you've called it. One of the other things I've seen in play, we've kind of described as like a Kafka trap. Mm-hmm. This is a logical fallacy that occurs when someone is accused of something and their defense is used as evidence of their guilt. So I actually found this helpful. J.D. Hall had posted this on Twitter, and he said, I've seen this argument in Woke Wars 1, and it seems like it's being used again. So he says, step 1, call someone a racist, bigot, or anti-Semite. Step 2, say whatever you want about them, no matter how dishonest, because that's how you're allowed to treat racist, bigots, and anti-Semites. Step 3, when you're called out for this, ask why they're defending racism, bigotry, and anti-Semitism. So these are, I think, variations. They're not all the same thing. But the Kafka trap is a little bit the same way. Like, I know that you're seething with hatred or crackling with envy, and the best way to identify someone who has that envy is they'll deny it. So then you're like, well, if I deny it, it just, in their way they set up the argument, well, then I'm guilty of it. It seems like, Brian, now asking about the gas cloud fallacy.
Yeah.
Why would this be particularly harmful? I mean, just thinking about Christian communities and Christian brothers, I guess 2 questions. Why is it harmful, and where have you kind of seen this happen?
So it's harmful because one of the things that it doesn't allow for is actually robust debate about things that can be somewhat nuanced or have multiple layers to them. One of the issues with some of the framing I've seen around, as an example, around the anti-Semitism charges, is that number one, the argument itself, we just have to admit, as uncomfortable as it is, because of the wiring we've all received from our cultural upbringing, just the stuff in the air, is that arguments about racism and anti-Semitism are left framed to begin with.
Yeah.
You're in stepping into those debates and treating them as existential threats, and as like one of the most serious things that's happening in the world today is there's a bunch of white racists going around who are going to, destroy everything. That is the leftist frame. It's why we brought up remember old Jack, C.S. Lewis, and what he said about fire extinguishers and floods. If you look at our culture today, and you were just to ask on an objective level, what are some of the biggest problems related to race, ethnos, all of these various tangled nest of problems? What is a bigger problem? White people, heritage Americans, however you want to put it, being taught to hate themselves and consider themselves as entrenched, structurally racist people destroying the world, who come from evil people, who that have a kind of privilege that was built on the back of black evils. Or is a bigger problem that white people are likely to, in sinful ways, go out and mistreat blacks, Latino, some other races or ethnicities out in the world. And I would argue that it's not even close. The far, far bigger problem, you just read a book like Jeremy Carl's Unprotected Class. I got that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
That
something
issue
in my
seems
head.
prevalent.
It's very prevalent. So one of the problems right now with the poison gas fallacy, the imprecision, is that one of the things it's trying to do is adopt this left-framed gatekeeping of a conversation itself. And what you're fundamentally doing, I think I see this a lot out of Doug's work in American Milk and Honey and some of the conversations surrounding this, are that what it amounts to is to say, you have to adopt my definitions on the definitional level. You have to adopt my arguments, or you are very likely one of these anti-Semitic or in danger of being anti-Semitic, black-hearted, seething kind of person. And so the tactic is like dropping a big gas cloud that's sort of imprecise in its defining characteristics over a whole conversation. And the tactic is flee the gas cloud to the only acceptable position in the debate,
right,
which is mine. And if you don't, then I'm not saying you're an anti-Semite, but you probably are. Or you're
somehow sympathetic.
So the problem with this is it's not precise enough, and it doesn't allow for genuine disagreement on the definitional level to actually say, like as we did in the cold open, well, hang on. Some of this language on the defining level you're proving too much. It's too broad. Other people have raised these criticisms of his work as well.
But I think even like Joe Soberin's point that we talked about was that in the West, one of the defining characteristics of our legal system, I think as it accords with the Ten Commandments and witness bearing, is that we should be precise in defining crimes and sins. But one of the tactics of the left is let's define them very loosely so we have a lot of power to condemn people. And then people go around in this existential dread. Well, I don't want to be called that, so I need to stay away from any list of topics that are even associated. One of the other things I think that's interesting, and we'll probably at some point, I think, do a more in-depth review on, say, like American Milk and Honey, some of the things we disagree with. But one of the things Doug says in there is he said, I think the Christian position on the Holocaust should be X, Y, and Z. And again, I think it's a blurring of categories where you're like, wait, I didn't realize there was a Christian position, like an orthodox position, in other words, on a historical narrative. Well, that really makes people, to Brian's point, I think, like, you're like, wow, I really don't want to question too much about the historical narrative, because it sounds like if I do, I no longer have the quote unquote Christian position.
One of the things that happens is that the further distance you get from an event, the more cartoonized often our recollections of it become. And this is just natural. You come to historical or scholarly consensus that's based on the conversations happened for a long time. And so people to develop, like the Crusades are a good example of this. One of the reasons we went through them and have gone through many elements of the Crusades and saying, well, the cartoonized version of the Crusades that the West basically adopted in its own self-reflection concerning its Christian tradition and history was to say the Crusades were unjustified wars of aggression by greedy Christians who were just going and destroying peaceful Muslims who were just trying to invent calculus, and we just wouldn't leave them alone.
Yeah.
And so we committed atrocities, and oh, by the way, against a lot of Jews along the way. Now, Christians sinned in the Crusades, but the point is that it's actually a lot more complicated than that. And so when you get, again, with the blasphemy laws attending an idol or some sort of ideological blasphemy law issue, when you start to say things like that about any historical event, I'm immediately suspicious. I have a red flag going up in my mind saying, there's something ideological happening here. Mm-hmm. There's something political and ideological that's less based about the actual truth of the events themselves than about the utility of this version of events for political reasons today. So to be clear, people are like, wow, they love the Nazi. No, that's not the point we're making. Isn't to all of a sudden assert our own cartoonized version of World War II that's like, Hitler was an unqualified Christian prince, and the Nazis were unqualifiedly the good guys, and Churchill was just this black-hearted thug who never did anything right, and he secretly tortured puppies in his basement. Like the point is, no cartoons anywhere. Let's do the difficult work of history, and also just recognize that there's a reason that more than one book is written about any historical event. One of the reasons is because even professional historians disagree about the nature of different events.
Well, that's why even, and very brief research on topics like what is the genetic history of the Ashkenazi Jews. Well, like 2 minutes of Google searching, and you'll find this is highly debated. It can often be very contentious. People don't agree. So that in and of itself should kind of be a warning to me when somebody says, this must be your position on the Ashkenazi Jews. And I'm like, well, but even the geneticists, who are many of which are not Christians, even they don't agree with something like that.
One clarification here I think is helpful with an actual example is that when a Christian is doing history, we want the Christian position on a thing really is what truly happened, because Christians believe in truth.
Yeah.
We don't want to believe something false. But you have to distinguish then between different layers of the Christian approach to a thing. The ethical approach to something like, let's take World War II. Christians should all agree, or at least there should be a really robust conversation about the ethics of firebombing civilians, right?
Agreed.
Christians should not be in the business of intentionally murdering women and children in combat. Okay, now that principle I just laid out, first of all, there's a debate that would happen historically concerning the horror of war and the ethical calculation of that claim. That comes into the Crusades, World War I, like all of the wars. All right, but the question I would have that would immediately arise from that on a historical level is then, let's say that we agree, some hypothetical group of Christians and pastors or whatever agreed on that ethical claim I just made. Well, then we would be forced to say the Allies were therefore extremely wicked and sinful in their approach to the war, in firebombing Dresden.
At least at many points.
And the Axis powers were extremely sinful in their actions in rocketing London and blitzkrieg. So we could say something like that. We could also say, as an objective ethical fact, that the Darwinism that was in the air at that time, that affected Germany, but also America, England, this absolutely ascendant Darwinism at that time, and its child, which is eugenics, led to some absolute evils and atrocities. For example, Hitler's, I think it's the T4, basically extermination eugenics program, where he ordered, and this is undisputed, where he ordered the liquidation, the murder of 1 million, basically like mental ward patients in Germany. And they had carried out this to the tune of at least hundreds of thousands by the time some church leaders in Germany within the party actually said, hey, you need to stop doing that. That this is actually just plain murder. And then he halted that program at some point. So we say that's evil. And then we could also say, and all of similar programs like that everywhere in the world that they were, because of this Darwinism in the air, all of those were evil. And what we've just done is some, like, not super complex, but a little bit more complex than a cartoon version of ethical analysis, treating history on its different layers of truth, the historical fact, the ethical fact. And this is the kind of thing that happens when you don't get emotional and try to shut down the whole conversation with left-coded epithets from the beginning. Mm-hmm. You can then have that conversation where people can get in the same room, or they can exchange books, articles, podcasts, whatever, and have a robust debate about some of these topics. But when you see that debate can't even be had, you're not even allowed to have that debate, and anybody having that debate on any level is an anti-Semite or is a racist or is, that screams Saul Alinsky, Gramscian Marxist, left-coded framing that all right-wing people should agree. Let's get rid of that. Let's actually just jettison that whole mode of exchange of ideas.
Yeah, let's at least be able to have a conversation, Daniel.
It is really interesting because if you recall, Doug Wilson, one of his favorite lines for the last, I don't know, however long I've been reading him, was that the war that we're fighting is actually control over the dictionary. And so it is really unhelpful when you define anti-Semitism as loosely as possible, so that even certain forms of noticing, as Yuri Burrito said, are not the same. You know, and so you're actually guilty. What's interesting with this leftist tactic that you were talking about, Brian, is that I actually experienced this firsthand. A lot of us have, especially millennials. I'm graduating from from college around the 2008, 2009 time period. And for you Zoomers, the economy was really bad. That was a housing crisis.
Yeah.
It was actually really, unemployment numbers were really high. So I'm getting out of college. I have college loans to pay off, and I'm trying to start a household and all this. And I'm in my college classes, business school. I had to take some HR classes, which is quite unfortunate, but I had to take some HR classes, and you had affirmative action at the time. So they had certain hiring quotas based on race and gender and things like that they had to fulfill. And so even if you graduated with good marks and you had a lot of experience, it didn't necessarily mean that you were going to be the best qualified person for the job because they had to fill their quotas. So that was what I was dealing with at the time. And if you noticed, like, I may or may not have at my public university, that was actually unjust. And it was actually a form of racism. You got a lot of pushback. Like, no, I'm not saying anything bad about any of these people that are within the quotas that they have to fill. But don't you think that we should just hire someone based upon their merit for the position and not necessarily just based upon their skin color? And automatically, because of the loose terms that they're able to control the dictionary and to define things, you're actually a racist for that sort of noticing, because you actually have privilege. And we've seen this played out, time and time again over the years into this self-loathing that is encouraged and shame for just simply being a white person and the privilege that you have, that you don't even understand why you have it, but it's because of that you're actually an oppressor, that you have the privilege that you have. And so you see this trap that was laid out for us and in that sort of noticing, but it's just being reapplied now in this topic of anti-Semitism, where even certain types of noticing is sinful, and you are the Nabal, that Abigail should definitely be warning their pastors against, just because you notice, like in the example that Pastor Sauvé gave about this historical narrative being actually, history is really complex. And so it really is, I think, a war over the dictionary. And so I think that those not being able to define your terms very tightly, but intentionally having the loosest form of a definition you can for a sin is really problematic, to the point where you're saying there are certain pastors that need to step down and certain church members that need to be put under church discipline just for laughing at the wrong thing or noticing the wrong thing.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting thing. It's in American Milk and Honey. I've seen it on the blog, and then Doug has repeated it, like in the Cross Politic episode, where he said the problem is Stone Choir, and then he went on to describe Joel as revoice for Nazis, and then most of the show is actually about Joel. So it really seems to be a gas cloud kind of attack. But what's interesting about this is you have this dynamic where you're kind of lumping all these things together. You're using pretty charged language. And then there's, as Brian said, there's always kind of an escape hatch of what didn't specifically say. It's kind of like the Buckley, like, what didn't say Buchanan was an anti-Semite? I just said he said and done some anti-Semitic things.